While champagne flowed and laughter echoed through a billionaire's mansion, a boy slipped silently beneath the surface of a forgotten pool. No one noticed, except Lena, the housemaid's daughter, just 11 years old. In a single breathless moment, she dove in and pulled him back from the edge of death, but saving his life was only the beginning. What unfolds next is a powerful journey between two children from opposite worlds, one quiet, one invisible, bound by a moment no one saw coming. Stay with us until the end to witness how one brave act can break walls, build family, and change destinies forever. It started with a splash that no one heard, a muted cry swallowed by water, and a silent leap that no one saw. Lena didn't run. She moved with purpose, her thin frame cutting across the marbled floor in swift, determined strides. The glass door to the east wing had been left ajar. She'd noticed it. Not by accident, Lena noticed everything. She had been watching Aiden all evening, not because anyone told her to, but because no one else was. He wasn't built for noise or parties or rooms full of laughing adults who didn't remember his name. When he slipped out of the main hall unnoticed, she waited 5 seconds, 10 maybe, hoping someone else would follow. No one did. That's when she stood up. She didn't ask for permission. The kind of girl she was didn't get to ask for anything. She just walked. And when she reached the pool and saw one small sneaker floating near the edge like an abandoned toy, she knew. Lena threw her body into the water without thinking, her shoes still on, her breath half held. This was not a thought. It was instinct. She was 11. He was 9. He was drowning. And there was no one else. The water wasn't clear, not in her mind. It distorted light and time alike. One moment she saw him suspended like a ghost, his arms out, head tilted back, lips slightly parted. The next, she was beneath him, pulling him up with muscles that shouldn't have been strong enough. But she was strong. Strong in the ways that matter. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. She wrapped her arms around Aiden's chest and kicked up with all she had. Her heart thundered in her ears as she breached the surface, dragging his limp body toward the shallow edge. Her hands shook as she hoisted his upper body out of the water, her knees scraping against the tiles as she half lifted, half rolled him to the side. "Come on. Come on," she whispered through clenched teeth, strands of her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. He wasn't breathing. His face was pale, lips already tinged blue. Lena placed her palms on his chest, the way she was taught during the after-school safety classes. 1, 2, 3, press. She counted. She pressed. She breathed for him because the world refused to. Every second was a stolen chance. She didn't think about herself. She didn't think about the consequences, only that he needed air. Now. The first cough was soft, like a secret. Then came another, louder, sputtering water across his chest. Lena sat back, eyes wide, panting as Aiden curled on his side and choked. He was alive. He was breathing. That truth hit her like a wave stronger than the one she'd swum through. She didn't cry. Not yet. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said nothing, watching him shiver and tremble, but remain very much alive. His eyes blinked open slowly, unfocused at first. Then he looked at her, really looked. No fear, no confusion, just wide-eyed recognition, like a boy seeing something that didn't fit inside his world, but suddenly made perfect sense. And then the sound returned, doors slamming, footsteps pounding, voices rising. Chaos. Aiden winced, covering his ears as if the noise itself could push him back under. Lena stayed by him, grounding him. She didn't flinch when the glass door crashed open and a blur of adults stormed inside. She didn't rise when the shadow of a man knelt beside her, grabbing Aiden into his arms. She only moved her hand from the boy's shoulder after he was safe in someone else's. "What happened?" someone barked. "Who was watching him?" another voice snapped. Lena didn't answer. She stood slowly, water dripping from her sleeves, her shoes squelching against the wet tiles. A woman she'd never seen before shoved a phone toward her face. Someone was filming. Of course. Everyone was always filming, but no one ever watched until it was too late. "That girl," someone said, "she pulled him out." The murmurs built like pressure in a pipe. "She jumped in? That's the Rodriguez girl, isn't it?" The word Rodriguez fell like it shouldn't belong in the same room as marble and crystal and designer gowns. Lena didn't blink. She stared straight ahead, not defiant, just steady. Aiden was sitting up now, clinging to his father's jacket, eyes darting through the crowd like he was searching for an anchor. Then he saw her, just her, and everything else, the flashlights, the outrage, the clamor, faded like it never mattered. She saved him. The voice was thin but clear. Aiden, speaking for the first time. All heads turned. His hand reached out, trembling, pointing past his father's shoulder. "She," he coughed, "Lena, saved me." No one spoke. The only sound was Aiden's breathing, shallow but real. Richard Evans, billionaire tech mogul, turned to look at the girl standing still as stone. For a second, he didn't know what to say. All the words he used to command meetings, sell ideas, close deals, useless now. So he stepped forward, knees on the wet tile. He lowered himself until he was eye level with the girl his money could never have imagined, and said low and rough, "Thank you, Lena." She didn't smile. She didn't bow. She didn't cry. Her arms crossed instinctively, fists curled as if preparing for punishment, not praise. She had no idea what came next. None of this was supposed to happen. She only knew Aiden had nearly died, and she had been the only one to see it. The only one who did anything. That was enough. It had to be. She nodded once, just once. The entire crowd watched her, not as an accessory to the household, not as the maid's daughter, but as the girl who had acted when no one else had moved. A second passed, then another. And then someone whispered, "Is she okay?" Too late for that question, too late for many things. Lena turned, water still clinging to her sweater, and walked toward the far door without another word. And still, Aiden watched her go, as if the world had narrowed down to one soaked girl in borrowed shoes and a fire inside her that no one had noticed until now. As if everything else, the wealth, the security, the luxury, had collapsed into background noise. Because maybe it had. Maybe the real story, the one none of them had meant to tell, began with a boy who couldn't swim and a girl who didn't wait, with a muted cry and a silent leap. The morning after the chaos felt like a strange performance where no one knew their role anymore. Lena arrived with her mother through the service entrance like always, her clothes still slightly damp from being hastily dried overnight, her sneakers stiff with chlorine. No one greeted them. No one smiled, but no one ignored them either. That was new. The hallway felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just quieter in the way people get when they don't know whether to offer praise or pretend nothing happened. Her mother hadn't said much since the night before. Only a curt, "Don't speak unless spoken to," and a long look as they walked in. But Lena wasn't worried about getting in trouble. She wasn't worried about being thanked either. She just didn't know where to look now that people actually looked back. Eyes flicked toward her, some lingering with guilt, others darting away in awkward haste. The house staff treated her like something between hero and rumor. She hated it. The ones who used to pass by without a glance now nodded too often. Those who once called her Mija whispered instead. Lena kept her head low, hands in the front pocket of her hoodie, and tried to disappear again. It didn't work. Her mother sent her to wipe down the breakfast area. It wasn't part of her job. Lena wasn't technically supposed to do chores during visits, but it was the safest thing to keep her occupied. The long glass table still had fingerprints from the party. Bowls of untouched fruit sat beside empty coffee cups and half-eaten croissants. But at the far end of the table sat Aidan, alone. He didn't look at her when she entered. His back was turned, hunched slightly over something. His elbows rested on the table, one hand holding a crayon, the other steadying a napkin. Lena stopped, cloth in hand, and stared. She thought about turning around, walking back out. Maybe that was what she was supposed to do. But he was just sitting there, scribbling, not fidgeting or asking for help, just focused. She stepped quietly around the table, wiping absently as she went. He still didn't move. The closer she got, the more she noticed the tension in his shoulders, like he was pretending to be calm and failing at it. Finally, she stopped a few feet away, waiting for him to acknowledge her. When he didn't, she almost said something, but bit her tongue. Then Aidan turned. Slowly, his hand moved forward, pushing the napkin across the table with quiet purpose. His eyes didn't quite meet hers. They hovered somewhere near her chin, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to look. She stared at the napkin. It wasn't just a doodle. It was a note, written in thick, uneven crayon letters that bent at the edges, but held together like something carefully constructed. It read, "Thank you, Lena. Want to play later?" There was a small drawing of two stick figures, one with long hair, one with shorter, holding what looked like a basketball or maybe a pizza. It didn't matter. Her name was there. Lena. Not hey, not girl, not her, not scribbled on the corner of a worksheet or forgotten on a list. Lena. In his messy, serious handwriting. It hit harder than she expected. No one ever wrote her name for no reason, and certainly not like this, not with intent. She looked up at him, his fingers fidgeted against the table edge now, eyes dropping to his lap. It wasn't just a thank you, it was a question. A door half open. "You drew this?" she asked softly, her voice coming out smaller than she liked. Aidan nodded, still not looking at her. "You remembered my name?" Another nod. "From yesterday?" He finally glanced up, just for a second, and this time his eyes stayed. "I remember everything," he said. Not boastful. Not robotic, just truth. She didn't know what to say to that. She picked up the napkin, smoothing the edges carefully like it was made of glass. It didn't feel like a drawing. It felt like an offering. And suddenly all the noise from the night before, the gasps, the shouting, the hands grabbing at her arms and pushing phones into her face, melted away. This was the only part that mattered, this one piece of crayon truth. He wanted to play later, with her, and not because someone told him to. Because he remembered, because he saw her, maybe not when she jumped in, maybe not when she saved him, but here, now, in this room where he never used to speak to anyone, here, he saw her. Lena slid into the seat beside him, not asking, not waiting for approval. He didn't flinch. She placed the napkin in her lap like a secret. "Okay," she said, voice low, "but you're picking the game." Aidan gave a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. "I have a ball. In the yard." She nodded once, like it was a deal sealed in law. They didn't need to say more. For the next few minutes they just sat. Lena still held the cloth in her hand, but she didn't clean. Aidan still had his crayons, but he didn't draw. Something shifted between them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something real. No expectations, no performances, no roles, just two kids on opposite ends of a house, learning how to meet in the middle. Later, maybe someone would notice, maybe someone would disapprove. But right now, there was only the napkin and the silence and a conversation that had already been answered. That piece of paper changed things, not like thunder, but like a crack forming under polished wood, small, silent, spreading. The kind of change no one sees until it's already done. Aidan had written her name not because he had to, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Lena knew that. She also knew it was the first true gesture anyone in that house had ever made toward her. No orders, no "thank you, dear," No eyes that flicked away after too long. Just a kid with crayons and a question, and a girl who jumped into a pool without hesitation. And now, a promise. A promise scribbled in red and blue, on a napkin that would never be thrown away. The weight of it sat in her lap. She didn't speak again. She just sat beside him, finally still, finally seen. And for the first time, she saw her name as something that could stay. They didn't make plans. That was too risky. Instead, Lena and Aiden found each other in moments, in the stolen slivers of time between schoolwork and silence, between expectation and disobedience. Aiden didn't have a schedule. Not really, but everyone around him did. Tutors came at fixed hours, therapists arrived with folders and soft voices, nannies kept their distance until called. Lena knew those rhythms better than anyone, so she waited for the gaps. The moments when no one was looking, when doors were left ajar and footsteps moved away instead of toward. That's when he would appear, a hand slipping from behind a curtain, a whisper from under the stairs. She led him to the places he wasn't supposed to go. He followed, not because he needed excitement, but because with her, he didn't need to explain himself. She took him behind the garage to the hidden herb garden her mother had once helped plant and everyone else forgot about. She showed him how to pinch mint leaves without snapping the stems. He told her secrets in return, like the fact that his favorite place in the house wasn't a room, but the crawl space above the wine cellar, and the secret tablet he kept hidden beneath his mattress. "It's just mine," he whispered once. "No one checks there." Their time was strange and silent, like an unspoken agreement. Lena never asked about the mother who wasn't there. Aiden never asked why Lena's shoes always seemed too small. Instead, they built their own rules. Aiden taught her to play one of the games on his tablet, something with colored balls and strategic explosions. Lena wasn't good at first, but she got better. She liked how serious he became, explaining the mechanics. His brow furrowed like a teacher. "You can't just tap," he would say. "You have to wait. There's a pattern." She tried, failed, and tried again, and he watched like it mattered. The game became their language. Aiden even drew a scoreboard in his notebook. Lena didn't know if anyone else ever played with him like that. She suspected not. In return, she taught him how to use the back door latch without triggering the creak. She let him step into her world, one corner at a time. The garden, the supply closet, the space behind the linen shelves where you could sit and feel invisible. They never talked about what they were doing. They just kept doing it, like kids carving a tunnel under a wall too tall to climb. But one afternoon, everything cracked. They were in the back hallway, the one behind the kitchen that led to the service exit. Aiden had kicked off his expensive loafers, stiff and uncomfortable, and was slipping on Lena's sneakers just to make her laugh. They were soaked from an earlier trip to the hose spigot in the garden. She dared him to walk the hall in them. "Bet you can't make it 10 steps without falling," she said, grinning. He took the bet. They were far too big for his feet, clumsy and flopping, but he was determined. What neither of them realized was that Richard, Aiden's father, had come home early. He'd cancelled a meeting unannounced. Aiden turned the corner wearing Lena's sneakers and skidded to a stop in front of his father. The hallway fell silent. Richard stared at his son's feet first, then his face. Then Lena, frozen halfway down the hall, her stomach tightening like a vice. Aiden opened his mouth to explain, but said nothing. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was rupturing. Richard didn't laugh, he didn't scold either. He just looked. At the shoes, at the water trailing behind Aiden's steps, at Lena, who looked like she was preparing to be erased. There was no smile, no understanding smirk, no softened expression. Just a tightening of the jaw, a furrowing of the brow, quiet disapproval dressed in silence. Aiden shrank back, pulling at the shoes as if realizing too late how much he'd crossed. "They're not dirty," he muttered, trying to tug one heel off. It was just..." But his father cut him off, not with words, but with that look. The one that says, "You know better." And that was worse than yelling. Lena took a step forward instinctively, as if to defend him, but stopped herself. This wasn't her scene. She wasn't allowed in this story. That's what Richard's silence said more clearly than anything. You don't belong in his shoes. He doesn't belong in yours. After that, no one moved for a moment. Then Richard gestured curtly to Aidan. "Change," he said. Aidan bent to remove the sneakers, his fingers fumbling. The shoes flopped to the floor with a wet thud. He didn't meet Lena's eyes as he handed them back, nor did she reach out to take them immediately. Richard turned and walked away without another word, leaving a trail of judgment behind him. Aidan stood in his socks, cheeks flushed, eyes downcast. Lena picked up her shoes without saying a thing. The fun was gone. The invisible line had been drawn again, deeper this time. Neither of them knew if it could be stepped over again. Lena turned to leave, but before she did, she glanced at Aidan. He was still there, still silent, but his shoulders had dropped in that way that children only do when they realize some things can't be undone. Not by games, not by drawings, not by shared secrets in the dark. The moment lingered, heavy, unspoken, fragile, and that was when the air between their worlds began to thicken, not with cruelty, but with the weight of how things were supposed to stay. The shoes were a symbol now, a joke that had stopped being funny, a boundary tested and punished. Aidan didn't follow her this time. Lena didn't wait. She returned to the parts of the house she was allowed to be in, clutching the damp shoes like they might fall apart if she loosened her grip. The hallway where they'd laughed only minutes earlier felt foreign now, off limits again. And as she turned the corner, the last thing she saw was Aidan standing exactly where she'd left him, socked feet flat on the tile, staring down at the empty space the shoes had filled, as if they were still there. Richard's request came through the housekeeper. Not a direct call, not even a note, just a quiet message passed from lips to ears like bad news. "Mr. Evans would like to speak with you and your daughter, privately." That word alone, privately, was enough to drain the blood from Lena's mother's face. She said nothing as she changed out of her apron, smoothing the creases from her blouse with trembling hands. Lena walked beside her silently through the hallways, each step slower than the last. When they reached the second-floor office, the one with the locked file drawers and leather-bound books no one read, Lena noticed her mother's hands were clenched into fists. "Let me talk," she whispered. "Let me fix it." Lena nodded, but she already knew she wouldn't stay silent. Richard stood when they entered, not as a gesture of respect, but control. He motioned for them to sit. "I'm not here to place blame," he began, in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. "I just need to understand what's happening between your daughter and my son." The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was structured, formal, the voice of a man used to debriefs, not confessions. Lena's mother cleared her throat and offered the expected apology. She spoke quickly, tripping over phrases like crossed boundaries and professional limits. Her accent thickened when she was nervous, and Lena hated how small her voice sounded in that room. "I didn't know, sir. I should have been paying closer attention. She's a good girl. She didn't mean any harm." Richard's expression didn't change. He folded his hands and waited. "The garden," he said. "The hallway, the shoes, the tablet. This isn't just a one-time thing, is it?" That's when Lena spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not." Her mother shot her a look that begged for silence, but Lena didn't stop. "I didn't sneak around to hurt anyone. Neither did Aidan. He was alone, all the time. And so was I." Her voice didn't tremble, but it cracked just enough to make Richard shift. "I wasn't trying to take anything from him. We were just not alone anymore." The sentence hung between them like smoke, soft but impossible to ignore. Richard's jaw tightened, His eyes, normally unreadable, flickered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no immediate rebuttal, just the slow realization that what she said had pierced through something. The silence stretched. 4 floors above them, Aidan was likely in his room, possibly building something with his hands, the only way he knew how to express what his mouth wouldn't. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, then looked down at his desk. "He doesn't talk to many people," he said finally, as if confessing something that embarrassed him. "Not since—" He didn't finish the sentence, and Lena didn't ask him to. Her mother sat very still, eyes trained on the floor. "And yet," he continued, "he talks to you. He follows you. He laughs." Richard's gaze lifted slowly to Lena. "He's laughed more this week than I've seen him laugh in the last year." Lena didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He already knew it was true. "He doesn't let people in easily. Not even me." The words didn't come out bitter, just hollow. Like he was speaking into a well and hoping something would echo back. "So why you?" Lena finally spoke, not defiantly, but honestly. "Because I see him, and he sees me." It wasn't a clever line. It was just the truth, spoken by a girl who had nothing else to offer but her sincerity. Richard nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then he stood. The meeting was over. There was no resolution, no punishment, no permission, just the awareness that something had shifted. Lena and her mother were dismissed politely, almost too politely, as if he didn't trust himself to speak again without showing something he wasn't ready to share. They walked out in silence, descending the staircase with the weight of something neither of them could name. When they reached the main hallway, Lena's mother turned to her. "You shouldn't have said anything," she whispered. Lena shook her head. He needed to hear it. Her mother didn't respond. There was no point arguing with a child who had already learned to carry her own truth. Later that evening, Lena returned to her duties. She polished surfaces and straightened cushions while the rest of the house acted like nothing had happened. But she could feel it in the way the butler avoided her gaze, in the way the staff whispered less and observed more. Something had cracked, not open, but enough to let light in. That night, Richard didn't go to his home office. He went to the room he hadn't entered in months, the guest room turned storage space, where he kept old boxes of his wife's things. He pulled down an album, one of the few he hadn't thrown away in the weeks after her funeral. He flipped through the pages slowly. Aidan as a baby, wide-eyed and wrinkled. Aidan as a toddler, clutching her finger with both hands. Then Aidan, maybe 6, maybe 7, grinning up at the camera with a smile Richard hadn't seen in years. His throat tightened. He closed the album, then reopened it. On impulse, he pulled out his phone and scrolled until he found the security footage from the East Garden, the one from 3 days ago, where Lena and Aidan had sat cross-legged in the dirt, inspecting leaves. They weren't speaking, just passing mint between their fingers and laughing at nothing, a simple sound, a genuine one. He played it again, then again, each time something pulled at him, something uncomfortable. The kind of discomfort that came when you realized you'd missed something that was always there. And that was what hurt most. Not that Aidan had connected with someone, but that Richard had never thought to look for that kind of connection in a girl like Lena. It wasn't malice. It was blindness. He had filled the house with devices, staff, and silence, thinking it would be enough to hold his son together, but it hadn't been. Lena had stepped into the spaces where love had once lived, and without permission or plan, she'd given something back to Aidan that Richard hadn't known was gone. Joy. Not loud or perfect, just real. That realization sat with him through the night. He didn't call for anyone. He didn't speak to Aidan. He just sat there, in a room full of photographs and memories, letting the silence do what words no longer could. And as the house settled above him, across 4 floors of unanswered grief, one sentence played on repeat in his mind. He was alone. I was too. It echoed like a wound, small, sharp, and finally open. It was the head housekeeper, Ms. Kendall, who delivered the news with the same flat tone she used to confirm grocery deliveries. She stepped into the laundry room where Lena and her mother were folding towels and said, "Mrs. Rodriguez, you've been relieved of your position. Mr. Evans has decided to relocate for a few months. Abroad, he sends his gratitude." The words didn't land at first. Lena's mother blinked, then slowly straightened up, clutching a towel against her chest like armor. "Excuse me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "It's effective immediately, Ms. Kendall continued, already turning to leave. "You'll receive 2 weeks' severance. HR will be in touch." Lena didn't move. She stared at her mother, then at the empty doorway. No explanation, no meeting, no discussion, just a decision made somewhere above them, one they couldn't touch. "Why?" her mother asked, almost to herself, but they both knew it didn't matter. This house had rules, unspoken and unbreakable, and somewhere along the line, they had crossed one. Lena stood still for a long moment before quietly asking, "Does Aiden know?" Her mother didn't answer. Because that, more than anything, hurt the most. They hadn't even let him say goodbye. Lena didn't cry, not right away. She helped her mother pack their things in silence, folding clothes with trembling fingers and carefully wrapping the few delicate items they'd kept in a drawer upstairs. Her mother moved quickly, eyes glassy but composed, like she was trying to make the exit cleaner than the dismissal deserved. Lena kept looking at the stairs. Every creak made her flinch, hoping it was Aiden, coming to stop them. But he didn't come, not during the packing. Not when they loaded the bags into the rideshare waiting at the curb, not when they stood at the side gate of the estate, the one used for staff departures. "He doesn't even know," Lena murmured, but her mother didn't correct her. Because they both understood the truth. He knew. He had to. And still, he wasn't there. That betrayal sank deeper than the dismissal itself. All Lena could think about was the game they hadn't finished, the mint leaves still growing in the garden they'd found together, the words they hadn't yet said. She felt it unraveling, thread by thread. No one was going to stop them, not even him, not even Aiden. It was the butler, Mr. Graham, soft-spoken and kind despite his rigid posture, who handed her the envelope at the last moment. He jogged out to the gate just as Lena and her mother were stepping into the car. "This was left for you," he said, out of breath. "Upstairs, on the floor." Lena took it with both hands, a thick piece of paper, folded many times over, wrinkled and warm from someone else's grip. She opened it carefully. Inside was a napkin. The napkin, the one from breakfast, with the crayon writing, the thank you, the drawing of 2 stick figures. But now it had something new, scribbled in hurried, uneven letters. "Will you come back one day?" Just that. No signature, just the question. Lena stared at it, as if the ink might change, as if looking harder would make the answer appear. "Was it from him?" her mother asked quietly. Lena nodded, folding the napkin again and tucking it deep into her jacket pocket. She didn't speak. Her throat burned. She felt her body nodding, agreeing to something unsaid. But inside, a storm was rising. Because this wasn't goodbye. Not really. Not if he still had questions left to ask. The ride away from the mansion felt like falling through silence. Lena didn't look out the window. She didn't want to see the vineyard rows or the manicured hedges or the room on the second floor where she'd once laughed so hard she'd dropped Aiden's tablet and cracked the screen. Instead, she held the napkin tightly in her hand as if it could dissolve without her touch. Her mother kept glancing at her but said nothing. There were no lessons to give, no warnings left. Just grief that had no shape or sound. Lena couldn't tell if she was angry or hurt or just tired. All she knew was that something had been growing between her and Aiden, slowly, carefully, like a rope pulled between two rooftops, and now it had been cut mid-air. No one gave her a reason. No one told her what Aidan had said or hadn't said. The absence hurt more than any confrontation could have. He had been there, he had reached out, he had seen her, and now, with no warning, she was being erased from his world like chalk in the rain. The napkin was the only thing that proved any of it had been real. They reached their small apartment before sunset. The lights were off, the windows dusty from weeks of absence. Her mother opened the door, dropped the bags inside, and sat on the old couch without a word. Lena stood in the doorway for a long time, the envelope still clutched in her fist. She finally stepped in, kicked off her shoes, and walked straight to her room, if it could still be called that. It felt like stepping backward into a life that no longer fit. She sat on the bed, unfolded the napkin again, and read the question for the 10th time. "Will you come back one day?" The crayon letters were smudged. Aidan had written it in a rush, probably with the same hand that once struggled to build towers from Legos without knocking them down. She pictured him writing it, folding it, placing it on the floor with trembling fingers. She imagined him waiting by the door, then walking away before anyone saw him. She wanted to scream. She wanted to go back. But all she could do was clutch the paper against her chest, curl into herself, and let her heart break in silence. At the gate, just before the car pulled away, Aidan had been there. He had stood behind the upstairs curtain, watching, holding something tight in his hand. His legs wouldn't move. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He stayed frozen, afraid that if he said the wrong thing, it would make it worse. And by the time he found the courage, they were gone. The house felt different after that, empty in a way it hadn't been before, not quiet. It had always been quiet. But now, hollow, as if something had been pulled from the walls. And Lena, riding away with his message pressed to her heart, felt the same. She didn't understand why they were being sent away. No one had explained. But that didn't stop her from knowing what was true. He had asked her a question. He had given her something that mattered. And she held it like a promise. A single napkin, a name, a question. "Will you come back one day?" She gripped it tighter. And though she didn't cry on the outside, somewhere inside her, everything collapsed. 6 months had passed, and Lena still couldn't decide if that felt like forever or just a pause in time. Their apartment in Oakland was small, 1 bedroom, no balcony, and windows that looked out onto a street filled with cracked sidewalks and power lines that buzzed in the summer heat. But it wasn't the size that bothered her. It was the silence, a different kind of silence than the one back at the mansion. There, it had been cold and calculated, built into the walls. Here, it was empty. She shared a mattress with her mother on the floor, since the landlord still hadn't fixed the ceiling in the bedroom. Every night, Lena lay on her back, eyes wide open, tracing the same water stain on the plaster above her. And every night she imagined the smell of rosemary, mint and soil, the secret garden they had once sat in for hours, talking about nothing and everything. That memory had color, and this life didn't. School was no different. No one talked to her unless they had to. She was too quiet, too tired, too removed. Her teachers called her bright but distracted. Lena didn't care. The only thing that felt real anymore was a napkin folded 12 times inside the back of her notebook. The napkin had been opened and refolded so many times that the edges were starting to tear. Lena kept it tucked behind a photo of her and her mother at the beach, a photo she didn't even like, so that no one would ever think to look there. Sometimes during class, when the lectures became a blur and the day felt particularly long, she would pretend she was reaching for her pencil and instead slide out the napkin just to feel the weight of it. "Will you come back one day?" Those words had been written in red crayon, smudged by a finger or maybe a tear. She still wasn't sure. She never answered, but she kept it close, like answering wasn't necessary, like holding it was the answer. Some nights, She caught herself whispering back to it when her mother was asleep. "Yes," she'd say into the darkness, "of course I will." But time kept moving, and no one from the mansion had called. No letters, no explanations. It was as if she had been erased completely. The thought stung less now, but only because it had become routine, an ache so constant it faded into background noise. She still looked up at the sky almost every day, not because she believed in signs, but because she needed a place to put her questions. The clouds didn't talk back, but they didn't lie either. She imagined Aidan looking at the same sky from somewhere far away, Switzerland maybe, or London. That's what her mother had overheard. Richard had taken the boy abroad for a long project. Lena wasn't supposed to know, but she always knew things no one said. She'd imagine him walking foreign streets with his hands in his pockets, head down, tablet tucked under his arm. She wondered if he still drew on napkins, or if he even remembered her at all. But every time she looked at the folded square in her notebook, she reminded herself he had written first. He had asked the question, and part of her was still waiting to be asked again. Her mother didn't talk about the mansion anymore. She worked long hours at a laundromat nearby, came home exhausted, and never brought up what happened. Lena wanted to ask her if she missed it, not the job, but the garden, the boy, the chance they almost had. But the words never came, so she just looked up. That night was colder than usual. A gusty wind leaked through the window frame, and Lena had curled herself tightly under a blanket with her arms crossed over her chest. Her mother was asleep in the other room, or at least trying. The city always had a way of keeping you half awake. Lena had been staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to shut off her thoughts. She kept replaying the last day over and over, the look on Aidan's face, the heaviness in her chest, the way the car door had closed and no one had stopped her. She hated that she still expected someone to come. 6 months was too long. He wasn't coming. She had convinced herself of that, but her heart hadn't gotten the memo. Around 2 a.m., she got up and walked to the window. It was something she did often now, staring down at the quiet street, the same cracked pavement, the same old stop sign. Only this time, something was different. A car, a black one, newer than anything parked on their block. It slowed near the curb and came to a quiet stop just beneath the streetlight. Her breath caught. She leaned closer, squinting. The windows were tinted, no one moved. For a second, she thought maybe it was a mistake, just another lost Uber or someone waiting for takeout. But then the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking around. He just stood there for a moment, like he knew exactly where he was. Lena's heart began to pound. She backed away from the window, her breath shaky. The man was tall. He walked like he carried weight, but not the kind you could see, the kind that settled into your chest and never left. She recognized that walk. She didn't need to see his face to know. Something inside her, something old and still alive, whispered the truth before her brain could catch up. And then, as he reached the front gate, he looked up, right at her window. Her legs froze. Her hands went numb. He pressed the intercom once, just once, then waited. And that was when the bell rang. A single chime, one note in the silence, the kind of sound that felt like a heartbeat you hadn't heard in months, suddenly returning to your chest. Lena didn't move for a moment. She stared at the door, as if it might vanish. Then she glanced at her notebook, still lying open on her desk, the corner of the napkin peeking out from behind the photograph. Will you come back one day? The question no longer hung in the air. It had arrived. Outside, Richard Evans stood still, coat collar turned up, eyes not on the door, but the window where he knew she'd be watching. And inside, Lena stood frozen in the dark, holding her breath, unsure whether to cry or run or open the door. The napkin crinkled in her hand. She didn't speak. She didn't whisper. She just watched the man who had once let her leave walk back into her life. And as the bell echoed again, softer this time, she knew this was the moment everything would change. Richard stood at the door like he didn't know how to be there. He wasn't dressed like a billionaire, no suit, no tailored coat. Just a simple sweater and jeans, and in his hands, not a gift bag, not a check, not even flowers, but a porcelain teacup, the kind Lena remembered from the guest cabinets back in the mansion. It looked out of place in the doorway of their run-down apartment, and yet somehow it made perfect sense. Inside the cup sat a brittle branch of dried rosemary, its scent barely reaching the cold air between them. He didn't say hello, not right away. His voice was different when he finally spoke, lower, more hesitant, as if the words weren't used to leaving his mouth. "Aiden still dreams about you," he said. Lena stared at the cup, at his hands, at the lines on his face she hadn't noticed before. Her mother appeared behind her, cautious and silent, and for a few seconds no one moved. "I know this is unorthodox," Richard continued, choosing each syllable like it might betray him. "But I came to ask if Lena might want to spend the summer with us, as a guest, not staff." He paused. "As family." Her mother blinked as if someone had slapped her. "Excuse me?" she asked, stepping forward, instinctively putting herself between Lena and the unexpected offer. "You fired me," she said, calm but wounded, "without a conversation, without dignity." Richard nodded, as if he'd rehearsed hearing that very sentence. "I did," he admitted, "and I regret it, deeply. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't know how to handle what was happening between them, between us." Lena's mother folded her arms, unconvinced. "You don't get to walk back into her life because you feel guilty." "I'm not asking you to forget," Richard said. "I'm asking you to consider what she and Aiden had. Still have. He talks about her constantly. He's been quieter than ever since she left." Lena, standing behind them, said nothing. She just watched the cup, the rosemary. She remembered planting it with Aiden in the corner of the garden, both of them laughing at how the leaves made their hands smell like old spaghetti. "We've tried tutors, therapists, playdates. Nothing works," Richard said softly. "But he drew her name last week, 5 times, just her name. I believe he needs her, and if I'm being honest..." He glanced down. "So do I." Her mother hesitated. The old protectiveness flared up again. "You expect me to just send her back into that world?" she asked. "Where no one looks at her unless she's holding a mop?" Richard's voice dropped further. "I see her now," he said. "I see what I missed. She's not invisible to me anymore. I think it took losing her to understand the place she filled, and it wasn't just with Aiden." Lena's mother studied him. The silence felt like an interrogation. Finally, she looked at Lena, who hadn't said a word since the door opened. "Do you want to go?" she asked gently, her voice thinning with effort. Lena's mouth parted, but no sound came out. She looked between them, the man who had pushed her away and the woman who had spent her entire life protecting her from people like him. Then she looked at the cup again. Slowly she stepped forward and took it in both hands. The porcelain was warm, not from tea, there was none, but from his palms. The rosemary was old, but familiar. She didn't answer, but something passed between them in that handoff. A beginning, maybe, or something very close. They sat at the small table after that. Richard didn't ask to come in, but her mother invited him anyway. Lena poured water into the electric kettle. No one spoke much. The quiet was heavy, but not hostile. Richard explained the offer in clearer terms. The summer, not the school year. A guest room, not a shared one. Freedom, not obligation. She'll have her own space, he promised. And no uniforms, no tasks, just time with us. Her mother listened, nodding, but Lena could see her fingers tapping against her knee, a quiet sign of anxiety. "And if she wants to come home early?" she asked. "Then I'll drive her myself," he replied. "The moment she says the word." Her mother turned to Lena again. "Only if you want this." Lena finally nodded, a real one this time. Measured, careful. "I want to see him," she whispered. "I want to see if he still remembers." Richard didn't smile, not fully, but his eyes did something softer than a grin. "He remembers," he said, "more than you think." When Richard stood to leave, Lena followed him to the door. She didn't hug him, didn't say goodbye. She just looked up and said, "Did you bring this from the garden?" She held up the teacup, now slightly cracked at the rim. He nodded. "It was the last thing that grew before we left," he said. Aidan picked it himself. Lena looked down at the rosemary, then back up at Richard. "Tell him I'm coming," she said, "but only if he still wants me there." Richard tilted his head, then said, "He does." He never stopped. Her mother stood behind them, her arms crossed, but her eyes less guarded. "We'll call you tomorrow," she said. He nodded once and turned to leave. The door closed slowly behind him. Lena held the cup in both hands, its cracked edge catching the light. For the first time in 6 months, she felt something shift. Not loud, not sudden, just something real. And when her mother walked back into the kitchen, Lena stayed by the door, breathing in the faint scent of dried rosemary. Not because it was strong, it wasn't, but because it had been grown by hands that remembered her. And for the first time, Lena felt seen, not useful, not convenient, seen. The summer started with a silence neither of them could quite name. Lena arrived with her bag packed in careful layers. More notebooks than clothes, more questions than expectations. Aidan had been waiting at the top of the stairs when she walked in, hands behind his back, eyes flicking toward her face and then quickly away again. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. He didn't run to hug her or smile with joy, but he didn't turn away. That was enough. Richard had tried. Lena could tell. There were new books on the shelf, games in the cabinet, even a second chair added to Aidan's room, like someone had been preparing for her, but none of it felt lived in. It was like walking into a story paused mid-sentence. Aidan was taller now and more careful. He didn't fidget the way he used to, and he asked fewer questions. During meals, he barely spoke. Richard made light conversation, read the news aloud sometimes, asked if they wanted to go to the lake. Lena nodded politely. Aidan always shrugged. But even in that quiet, something lived. A tension that wasn't fear, just distance, like a thread that had frayed but not yet snapped. Lena didn't force anything. She never had. Instead, she wandered through the house, the hallways, the places that used to feel forbidden. The garden had changed. Weeds had crept in where the herbs once stood proud. The rosemary bush had withered into a brown knot, and the mint patch was nearly overrun. No one had touched it. Lena knelt beside the dry beds and began pulling the roots loose, her fingers caked in soil within minutes. She didn't ask for permission. She never had to. The house, despite its coldness, had always given her quiet pockets to be herself. Aidan found her there a few days in. He didn't say hello. He just sat near her, knees pulled to his chest, watching as she dug her fingers into the dirt and whispered names of plants he used to help her remember. "That one was thyme, remember?" she said softly. "You said it looked like fairy moss." Aidan didn't respond, but she saw his lips twitch, not a smile, just memory. Every day he came back. Some days they planted. Other days they just sat in the heat, saying nothing. Richard watched from the balcony sometimes, coffee in hand, but he never came down. One afternoon, Lena found Aidan sitting on the stone bench near the far end of the garden, a place they'd rarely gone before. He held his tablet, fingers still, not swiping or tapping, just staring. She sat beside him without asking. On the screen was a photo of a woman Lena recognized from the mansion walls, Aidan's mother. Her smile was small, like she wasn't used to smiling, and her eyes looked a lot like his. She liked lavender, Aidan said suddenly, eyes still on the screen. I used to crush the flowers in her hand, and she'd pretend they were perfume. Lena looked at the photo. You smell like her sometimes, Aidan added, barely audible. Lena didn't know what to say, so she didn't speak. She just reached out and let her fingers touch the soil near the bench, where tiny green shoots had started pushing through. Aidan closed the tablet and looked at her. "Does it make you forget?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, it just makes the remembering easier." That was the first day he looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her, really at her. And for the first time in weeks, Lena felt like something was healing. Later that evening, after Aidan had gone to bed, Lena found Richard in the study, sitting alone, with the same tablet in his hands. The screen was dark, but he was still staring at it. His jaw was tight, one hand resting over the other like he didn't trust himself to move. "She used to sit right there," he said without looking at Lena, "on the floor with a book in her lap. Aidan would crawl into her lap and fall asleep. I never took a photo of that." Lena stood in the doorway. She didn't enter. "Why not?" she asked. Richard sighed. "I thought there'd be more time. More chances." A long silence settled between them. Then he turned toward her. "I can't talk about her. Not with Aidan. Every time I try, the words die in my mouth. Like saying them makes it too real." Lena nodded. She understood more than she wanted to. "Maybe he doesn't need you to say much," she said. "Maybe he just needs to know she was here, that she mattered." Richard looked down, then back at the empty floor beside his chair. "Do you think that's enough?" Lena walked away without answering. Some things didn't need answers, just presence. The next day, Aidan found a lavender pot on the garden wall. It hadn't been there before. The soil was still fresh. He didn't ask who planted it. He just sat beside it and began trimming the dry ends with childlike precision. Lena joined him an hour later. They didn't talk, but she noticed something different in the way he moved. Less hesitant, more certain. That evening, Richard came out to the garden for the first time in weeks. He didn't say anything, just placed a photo on the table between them. It was an old one, the three of them years ago from a trip to the lake. Aidan picked it up and studied it. Then he looked at his father. "Did she like tea?" he asked. Richard blinked, then smiled faintly. "She loved it, especially with honey and mint." Aidan nodded and placed the photo face up next to the rosemary. Lena didn't say anything, but she felt something shift between them. A bridge, not fully built, but finally visible. And just like that, things that had once felt too heavy to speak began to settle into the space between them. And with that small sentence, "Maybe he just needs to know she existed," something that had remained stuck for far too long began to move again. A new bridge had been laid, quiet and invisible, but strong enough to carry the weight of grief and memory between a father and son, and the girl who had reminded them how to begin again. Lena jolted upright in bed, her breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a cry. The nightmare had come quickly and left her trembling, unable to recall all the details, but knowing with absolute clarity that in the dream, Aidan had disappeared. Not drowned, not taken, just gone, erased. The room was dim and quiet, but the fear still clung to her skin. Without thinking, she slid from under the covers and crept to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught again, but this time from something real. There, curled in a loose ball against the wall, was Aidan. He wore his pajamas, clutched a corner of his tablet to his chest like it might ward off ghosts, and had a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. He was asleep, but not peacefully. His brow was drawn in that same wrinkle she'd seen the day he'd been told she was leaving. She crouched down beside him, careful not to wake him, but even in sleep he shifted slightly toward her. That tiny movement told her everything. He was scared too, scared that silence could come again and swallow everything good they'd just begun to build. And tonight, he hadn't wanted to face that alone. Lena sat there for a long time, knees to her chest, shoulder to his. She didn't go back to bed. She didn't even speak. Something about Aidan's presence on the cold floor outside her room made her feel both sad and understood. It wasn't just a child's whim. This wasn't about a bad dream or needing company. It was about that unspoken fear that one day she wouldn't be there again, that she'd vanish like all the other people who passed through his world and left quietly without a trace. She didn't want to disappear, and she didn't want him to keep waiting for people to vanish. Eventually, his head fell softly against her arm. She stayed still. When the house stirred to life just before sunrise, she slipped back inside her room, quietly closing the door behind her, her chest tight with a truth she hadn't been able to put into words. They were still healing, both of them, in different ways, but they were healing together now. The next morning passed slowly. Breakfast was quiet and no one spoke much. Lena noticed that Aidan was unusually still, stirring his cereal more than eating it. When Richard walked into the room holding a large mug and asked her to follow him for a moment, she hesitated, shooting a look at Aidan, who gave her the slightest nod. She followed Richard up the stairs, heart racing with that old instinct, fear of reprimand, of being reminded she didn't belong. But instead of scolding or rules, he stopped in front of a door she didn't recognize, cracked slightly open, with the smell of new paint floating out. "We're having this room redone," Richard said, clearing his throat. "For visits. Special ones." He tried to say it lightly, but there was a weight behind the words, like he wasn't sure if he was saying too much or not enough. Lena stepped forward, barely breathing, and pushed the door open a bit more. Inside was a small, bright room, walls half-painted, a shelf being installed, a simple bed pushed to one corner, still unmade. Her eyes landed on something near the floor, a small wooden plaque taped to the door with neat, uncertain handwriting. Lena's room. She froze. Her fingers curled at her sides. Richard shifted beside her, suddenly awkward, like he regretted something. It's not much yet. We just thought, Aidan thought, mostly, that you should have your own space when you're here. A real space. One that's not borrowed." Lena didn't say anything. Her throat was too tight. She walked slowly into the room, crossing over the rough patches of floor, and touched the frame of the shelf. Everything still smelled new, uncertain. But the gesture, that was old. That was what she'd longed for. Someone marking a place for her, not because they had to, but because they wanted her to stay. She turned back toward the door, her eyes catching on Richard, who stood quietly in the hallway, not pushing her, not rushing the moment. And in that space, with paint still drying on the walls and dust settling on the windowsill, she felt something shift deep inside her. This wasn't just kindness, it was belonging. She found a piece of chalk resting on the windowsill, left by one of the workers, maybe. She held it for a moment, her fingers dusted in white, and walked to the far wall. Without a word, she leaned down and wrote her name. Lena, in all capital letters, blocky and firm. The letters weren't perfectly straight, and she smudged the E a little, but she didn't fix it. It felt real, permanent, even if the chalk could be wiped away. It wasn't about the writing, it was about claiming something. A name on a wall, not as a helper, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged in that house. Behind her, Aidan peeked in and smiled, not with his mouth, but with his whole body. He didn't need to say anything. He'd already said enough, just by being outside her door last night. When she stepped back into the hallway, her eyes fell once more on the small plaque, Lena's room. It didn't matter that it was handwritten, that it was taped with painter's tape, or that the room wasn't finished. It mattered that someone had written it. That someone, Aidan, had thought she deserved a space of her own. And more than that, Richard had allowed it, encouraged it. Something wordless passed through her as she looked at them both, then back at the room. She didn't cry. Not there. But the knot she'd carried in her chest since leaving that night 6 months ago finally began to loosen. For the first time, Lena Rodriguez wasn't just passing through. The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in a soft amber light, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone path. Flowers bloomed again in bursts of color, the same ones Lena had replanted over the summer, lavender, mint, and the stubborn rosemary that always came back, no matter how forgotten it had been. Lena sat cross-legged on the grass, her back against the bench, her fingers stroking Aiden's hair as he lay curled with his head resting gently on her lap, completely at ease. Across from them, Richard sat in the old wooden chair, holding a worn book in his hands, his reading voice steady and calm, even if he paused every few pages to check if Aiden was still listening. He wasn't. He had drifted off about halfway through the chapter, but neither of them seemed to mind. It wasn't about the story anymore. It was about being there, about being together. Aiden's arm wrapped loosely around Lena's leg, as if grounding himself. She looked at Richard once, and he looked back. Nothing needed to be said. The peace of that moment, after all they had been through, spoke louder than any words could. On the small outdoor table, unnoticed for most of the afternoon, sat a simple white envelope. It looked unremarkable, almost out of place among the living things and laughter and silence that now defined their little family. But inside it held papers that would change everything. Papers that had taken months of quiet conversations, late-night thinking, and careful steps. Papers with signatures and stamps and full names, declaring in legal terms what their hearts had already decided. Richard hadn't brought it up immediately. He didn't want to pressure Lena, didn't want to treat the idea like a reward or a transaction. But she knew. She had seen the way he spoke to her mother, with respect now instead of dismissal. She had heard the quiet way he asked Lena what she wanted for dinner instead of assuming. She had felt it in the care he took when adding her name to things, her voice to decisions, her presence to the family rhythm. The envelope was not a surprise. It was a confirmation, an acknowledgement. And yet, it made her throat tighten all the same. Later that night, after Aiden had been gently carried to his room by Richard, still half asleep, mumbling something about dragons and sandwiches, Lena walked to her own space. Her room. The one with the shelf full of books now, and the lamp she'd chosen herself, and the photograph of her and Aiden at the lake printed on thick paper, tucked into a frame Richard had ordered without telling her. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked toward her desk. There, above it, hanging in a small frame, was the garden apple, the napkin Aiden had given her all those months ago, the one that started everything. It hadn't faded. She had kept it flat, and Richard had surprised her one afternoon by getting it professionally mounted. Her name, written in that wobbly handwriting, still made her chest flutter. She reached out and straightened the frame, and that's when she noticed something else tucked just behind the mat board. A corner of another folded note, barely visible. Carefully she removed the back of the frame and slid the paper out. It was smaller than the napkin, a torn piece of notebook paper folded in quarters and softened at the edges. She opened it slowly, hands trembling, already knowing whose handwriting she'd see. The letters were uneven, but the meaning hit her square in the chest. It read, "Now you saved me again." But this time, it was inside. She stared at it for a long time, tears burning the corners of her eyes, but she didn't cry right away. She just let the words settle, nest in that place inside her, where so many others had vanished before being understood. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not teachers, not other kids, not even adults who claimed to care. But Aiden had, because he had felt it, because he knew what it meant to be broken quietly without anyone noticing. And because somehow, in their shared silences and hidden places, she had helped put something back together inside him, just as he had done for her, in his own quiet way. Lena placed the note next to the napkin, both of them now living in the same frame. She sat back on her heels and looked around the room, not borrowed, not temporary, hers. The pale walls no longer felt blank, but full of invisible memories. She remembered the night she had slept on the floor next to Aiden, the time he taught her to use the drone he wasn't supposed to have, The day Richard let her pick what they'd plant in the garden. They weren't flashy moments, but they were real. And for someone like Lena, who had grown up being told to stay out of the way, to be quiet and useful, to not expect too much, this was everything. She breathed deeply, steadying herself, letting the weight of safety settle on her shoulders like a soft blanket. She didn't have to be ready for everything that came next. She only had to trust that she didn't have to do it alone. In the morning, they would talk. The envelope would be opened. The documents would be read and signed. Richard would say something awkward but earnest, and Aidan would pretend to hate hugs while squeezing her arm too tight. But for now, in this quiet, final, golden moment of the chapter they never saw coming, Lena smiled. A genuine, full smile that she didn't have to hide. The garden was blooming again. Aidan was sleeping safely. The family that no one expected, least of all her, was no longer just possible. It was real. And finally, Lena Rodriguez was exactly where she belonged. We're so grateful you've spent time with us today. Every story we share here is crafted with deep care because we believe in the power of moments that change lives, just like Lena and Aidan's. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. It truly helps us continue creating more meaningful content like this, made especially for you. Feel free to explore our other videos and let us know in the comments. What part of this journey moved you most? Your voice matters here. Thank you for being part of our community. We'll see you in the next story.